Hello, this is Micah Wiersma. Today I'm going to be trying things a little bit differently than pinning things on the wall. I'm going to be kind of doing a digital pin-up, so to speak, with a couple different documents flying all over the place, so bear with me. But here we see some of the main ideas that I've gotten through this semester of research methods relating to my discourse, my methods, and my context that I've researched throughout the course through the lens of LTL Architects, who is my case study. The discourse here is human interaction with space. The method is creating spaces based on criteria of human interaction, of space-to-space interaction, and of building-to-site interactions. And then the context becomes this qualifying criteria for site-building relationships, building relationships between the site and the building. So that one context of those three different scales is very important to each section of my research this semester through how LTL deals with the buildings around it. And you see here building scale exploration towards the end, that transition towards more of a space to site interaction where all the spaces relate to each other as a building, but then the building has this very interesting relationship to the site where it opens up in some places or closes off in other places depending on certain criteria. And these are ways that LTL really brings out certain methods in the way that they design their buildings. The very first thing that I started with in the discourse section was looking at this nebulous idea of how LTL architects can look at the ergonomics of a space, especially through a case study of a deaf-blind center. One of the few things you can see here, relating to LTL architects, kind of main tenets that they give and they talk about in most of their ideas is catalyzing constraints, which relates directly to their context around them, what criteria they have that relates to what they need to react to in their design, and also connecting spaces, which we really relate to heavily in all the methods and the discourses in my research of this semester. You see here some of the examples of how they look at different relationships between people, especially in a deaf hearing impaired school, how the relationships between spaces can affect communication between humans, the way that they interact with their space, the way that they kind of explore their space as well. So you can see here how they study their space and the reaction to it, either post or before, as they experience how people or look at how people will experience the space. Here we can see start to suss out these relationships between the people and their space and how different forms of communication relate to how they relate to their space, ergonomics of how different seating positions, how different places that people sit and talk and have conversation can relate to how exactly they speak. Do they speak with their hands or do they speak with their mouths? Because that changes the function of the space when you need private or non-private conversations. Even the design of a kitchen. Many kitchens are outward facing. If you had to sign with your hands, as I've been doing most of this presentation, you would want an inward facing kitchen. So this all relates to the way that spaces and kind of the very small details of a building could relate directly to a human and not just be a blank wall that you're never supposed to touch. It's something that you directly relate to and interact with. You see some of the other ways that they qualify those as they go on. So this kind of pours into our idea of humans relate to these very specific parts of the building, and then these very specific parts of the building, stairs, steps, seats, spaces, all relate to each other and flow into each other. These transitions are really big on LTL's value scale of how they design their building. And so you see the method that they approach with is kind of this observation interview and then spatial documentation and exploration. Their method is very much related to how how they observe the space, how they talk about people's needs programmatically, spatially, and then they usually go with very, very accurate models of the space so that they know that they completely understand it. They explore it in section, in plan, and start to see how these different spaces relate to each other and to the people inside of them. None of their renders lack people, so they can always see the scale and the way that they relate to each other. You see here how different parts of the building are fully interactable, seating, different ramps, different half walls that all transition into full walls or relate to spaces or make things private or public, or transitions more soft or hard between different spaces that really relate to, should this area be connected to here in a very flowing way, or should it be more cut off so that these two areas can have their privacy from each other. And so we start to sketch out some of these relationships to get a feel for where there's pedestrian traffic, where there's seating, where there's relaxation spots, where one element, like a desk, as you can see maybe down here, can flow into a stair, or a seating area can turn into a stair as well. How seating areas and stairs can be interrelated to each other, so it's a pedestrian walkway, and then it's also an area to stop and do an activity or relate to the social activity around you. And we're actually taking the social activity that LTU always tries to ingrain into their projects for granted. It's more of a backdrop. We know that they're going to try to socially activate a space. The question is, how are they doing that through their use of spaces and their use of the connection to the people? And so the case study that we finally get to about a nice example of how all these things relate to each other is a certain project that focuses very clearly on a wrapping of a building. It's an existing building. It doesn't have very good relationships between the spaces inside and then in the exterior context. So LTL comes in, simply wraps the building, completely changes the way that it relates to the human scale and to the site scale and to the spatial scale, and relates them all together. Here we see kind of the method of the section and the relationship between people and the spaces come through as kind of a study of how each one of these areas relates to its site contexts, soft indoor, outdoor relationships. And we have a little bit of a update on some of those conditions here, how they relate to local sound, traffic. There are very heavy roads, sometimes 2 or 3 lanes to the north there that you can see, and then there's a very kind of private road just for the school and the parking next to that. That's not going to cause too much noise, and then a railroad track to the south there. And that kind of informs how they create these different transitions, these different spatial contexts, and relationships between each other. You can see, almost tell here which side faces the train tracks. Is it the side that flows outside? Is it the side that's completely open to outside? No, it's the side that has a hard fence and a hard roof. It has a little bit of a relationship to the outside. There's a visual connection, but it's still blocking sound. It's still kind of keeping the outdoors at arm's length, whereas the side that kind of faces a offset pedestrian walkway and a decently active street is more soft. It has a very low wall. It has very open relationships between this kind of outdoor space, the indoor space, and then the actual site beyond that. It's just kind of a volume that's defined in this area. And then you see down that below, another one of the principles, that connection between spaces. You see wood, you see the desk that the receptionist sits at become the bench outside of the door for people to rest at when they're leaving or entering the building. You see all these relationships kind of come together in these ways. And this skin that just kind of wraps the building, you can see down here below how each one of these conditions is kind of called out and shown to be a large factor in how the building is designed. So here you see it called out again with a little bit more explanation. hard separation is mentioned. Open forms, such as the entrance circulation down here, from there to there, that kind of shows something that opens up and embraces the area. It's more of an open shell instead of a closed off wall, and then an area that kind of leads you in. So it might be a very blank wall that discourages approach, and then something that angles quickly in to usher you in, or it might be something like this public gathering space down here that completely opens up to the outside world, is encouraging interaction between the occupants of the building and the occupants of the site, such as, in this case, faculty and students. That makes a very interesting relationship between the two. And so here we start taking that out of its specific context and reapplying it to different contexts. This is actually the LTU building here, although it does have some nice entrances, some nice public areas. The relationship to the site is a very hard, non-transitional siding of the building, just doors that go out into the pedestrian walkways and don't really relate to the site in any way. So here we start applying things like forms that lead in, forms that funnel people towards the entrance, other public gathering areas that have inviting elements such as openings, kind of human scale interventions such as these areas here. Here is something that leads someone in, kind of invites someone towards this area, while the tall imposing parts here and here kind of throw them off. This doorway can lead them into the public gathering, while the private gathering kind of has a hard, straight surfaced wall. This wraps the whole building to give it a visual identity, and then keeps creating these kind of half-open spaces that are inviting for people from inside the building and outside the building to interact along pedestrian walkways, so that they can be quick interactions, they can be casual, while private gathering spaces can be more about events, can be more about pre-planned things, mostly between the building occupants and other people there. So it kind of keeps collaboration at arm's length here, while inviting it here, based on its proximity to the pedestrian walkway and people that would be going by, and also the parking lot over here. And this is also just an idea of how this area can be very inviting, while as areas offset back here, maybe some of the areas over here can be a little bit more private, based on the method that LTL kind of applies towards the way that it approaches design. And from all this, you kind of get this method, that relates to context, that relates to the discourses of human interaction and what it means for people of different abilities, even just everyday people. How is it that our particular bodies, our size, our height, relates directly to this ergonomic idea of the building, and how can that create different spaces and different relationships to the sites? It's all about these 3 different sizes that slowly scale up, and how that gives the building meaning in design, and how methods and contexts relate to that meaning in design. I see I'm a little bit over time, so I will leave you at that. Thank you.